The book is called Finding Her Voice, and it's a compilation of columns that I've written specifically about women in about over a 20-year period after I came here. And as I say in the introduction, I moved to Iowa from the East Coast. I was raised primarily in New York, and when I came here, I was kind of armed with a New Yorker's sense of injustice and absolutism, which meant that, you know, no injustice should go unpunished or unacknowledged. And I found that Iowans were very kind people, very caring people, had a great sense of community, but often didn't speak out enough when something was wrong, when someone was being discriminated against. And I saw that there were a lot of different cases of discrimination against women, especially in smaller communities around the state, that went unredressed. And a lot of them were from institutions, whether the police department or the county attorney's office or the public welfare system. Or the school system, and that oftentimes women were not raising their voices enough about it, were not protesting, were not championing their causes, and yet a lot of women were very quietly trying to make a difference and dealing with cases of inequality and injustice. So I started writing columns about a lot of those instances, and they range from everything from, in a small town called Pleasantville, Iowa, there was a coach who was very popular because he kept winning games, but he was accused of sexually harassing two students who helped with the team statistics and scores for him, two girls. And when they complained about it, the community actually turned against them and was very hostile towards these two because this guy was a winning coach and because the team was always winning games, and coaches in small towns tend to be extremely popular people. So going against that institution was in a way making them pariahs. And I started writing about their case, and a couple of women came forward who had had the same man as a coach like 30 years ago when they were much younger, and they said that he had also sexually abused or harassed them, and they had tried to do something about it, but the school district never listened. So you knew that there was a pattern here. And yet, you know, women would see these girls coming towards them and would spit at them or say nasty things to them on the street because they didn't want them to be saying bad things about the coach. So it had all been sort of kept under the rug, and the school board didn't vote to do anything to him, no kind of penalty. And I wrote a column about it saying, you know, this is outrageous. First of all, how can a coach get away with harassing his female students? And secondly, why would the community line up with the aggressor and the abuser when there's evidence that this has been going on for decades and nobody's done anything? So at that point, the Iowa Board of Education actually suspended his teaching license. He was also a teacher for 2 years. So some justice was done. And then I started writing other columns like that. In some cases, I've chronicled the activism of particular groups of people where they have brought about change, and I've simply written about it. And I'll give you one example, which is actually, this is one of my favorites. Again, this involves young female students at a school. So in Ames, Iowa, there was a group of middle school students, and they had been getting a little sick and tired of the fact that the boys in their school were always wearing Hooters t-shirts to school. Now, I'm sure you know about Hooters restaurant. It's a chain, and it's very popular for that name. And of course, the word Hooters is an allusion to female breasts. And some of these girls thought that that was maybe not the most collegial move in coeducation, as I said in my column. And so they wanted to make a point. They did not want to get anything banned, and they certainly didn't want to get the boys in trouble, but they wanted to make a point to the boys about how it would feel to have a t-shirt that's sort of making you squirm because of your gender every day worn to school, and nothing is said about it by a teacher. So they got together with a supportive teacher, and they designed their own t-shirt, and it was called Cox, Nothing to Crow About. And the girls and a couple of supportive boys who supported their agenda and the education that they were trying to do tried to get permission to wear those t-shirts just for one day so that they could make a point. And that permission was denied. So a couple of the kids wore them anyway, and a couple of them turned them inside out that day. And the ones who wore them got suspended from school. So if you can imagine the differential treatment here, that for 1.5 years, these boys were wearing these Hooters t-shirts without any kind of consequence, and the girls and some supportive boys tried to, for just one day, to just show what was being done here, tried to do the opposing message when it made boys the target, and the school would not tolerate it, not even to get a message across. So the girls were very savvy. They had been reading the newspaper. They knew about my column. They knew that I wrote about women's issues, and they contacted me and said, "We'd like you to come out to our school because we're having a public forum about this, and we have the president of the American Civil Liberties Union who's going to come and address this issue. We're going to talk about free speech and sexism." And he said, those students are the Hooters t-shirts. All theirs was about was sexism, and ours was about a message about free speech and about, appropriate speech and offensive speech. So basically, as I wrote in the column, they brought the school to its knees. I mean, all of these people came. The school district was forced to admit that it had made some mistakes in the way that it handled it. That story went national, and I was getting requests from all over the country for those Cox Nothing to Crow About t-shirts that the girls had come up with. And it was such a creative way, I think, of resolving the situation, of calling public attention to the inequities there. And yet, instinctively, when faced with a situation like that, the school tried to take away these young girls' voices, whereas it had been giving the boys' voice for all of these, for all of these months. So that was a story where I didn't have to do anything except, make the world aware of what they had done and what was going on. And there have been, others like that as well. My columns are distributed nationally 1 day a week. So I write 3 columns a week for the newspaper, for the Des Moines Register, for primarily an Iowa audience, but then one of those is sent out nationally a week. And I think really most of these stories have a national impact, and some of them are about national figures as well. For example, I wrote about the nuns in the bus tour a couple of years ago when nuns were protesting against Paul Ryan's budget and saying that it was undermining social services and funding for social priorities, and they came through Des Moines, and I got a chance to sit on their bus with them and talk to them about what some of their priorities were. Or in a case where Sister Helen Prejean, who was the author of Dead Man Walking, came and she spoke about her anti-death penalty crusade and about the story that was popularized in the film Dead Man Walking and in the book. I had a chance to sit down with her. I've had a chance to interview Gloria Steinem when she's been here about feminism and sort of the changing face of it and the kinds of impacts that feminism has had or not had on young women today compared to women of my generation. And then there are stories that maybe the person who I use to tell the story, because this is a vehicle I often use in trying to get across a point, is I use a person to kind of exemplify an issue. And even though that person is based in Iowa, the issue is rather global. So, for example, I interviewed a woman. A woman contacted me some years ago and said that she wanted to get the word out about transgenderism, that she was born female, but really had this feeling that she was born into the wrong sex. And she identified with males much more. And she was going through a process of actually taking hormones and trying to change her identity. And at that time, it was back in the 90s, and really in Iowa, very little was known about transgenderism, and probably around the country too. It was the early 90s. But she wanted me to follow along with her through this journey so that people would understand what it meant. And I did that, and I think it really opened a lot of eyes up to why people might do that. Why, and she lives in town now. She's still a member of the community. She's very creative. She's a filmmaker. And she wanted to talk about exactly what was going on, that this is not something that she considered a choice, but rather, something that was inherent in her as a person, that she was not meant to be a woman. She was meant to be a man. And to watch how other people around her reacted and how she was able to, reestablish a love life and how she was able to continue to do her job and so on. So I think that was a very educational piece for people across the country. Similarly, when there have been columns about encroachment upon women's rights, for example, efforts to ban certain kinds of birth control in the state, or Walmart refusing to carry the morning after pill, that has national implications for women everywhere, even though we might have become aware of the story initially in Iowa. So there are many, many stories that originate here, but that really are relevant to anybody anywhere in the country and even beyond the country. The column that had the most impact on me, that really I think changed my life and got me thinking about why this kind of work is so important, and calling attention to these victims is so important, was one involving a young student at a Catholic high school in Des Moines, a young woman, who said that she had been raped at her school by a fellow student. Now, this student came from a rather well-placed family. The father was in broadcast. He was a very well-known name in town. And she came from the proverbial wrong side of the tracks, single-parent household, low-income household. They didn't have access to power. They didn't have access to people with any kind of clout in the community. So she didn't get any justice when she didn't even come to the school authorities and say that she had been raped by this man. She started mouthing off because people were harassing her, were giving her a hard time, supporters of this young man who she said had raped her. So she was mouthing off in class and getting into trouble because she was so angry. So the police did a little bit of digging to find out why there was this tension between her and this group of students, and they found out that it was because this young man had allegedly raped her, and it happened in school in a utility closet near the theater room. So what does the school do? It expels her. It expels the young girl from mouthing off in class and not handling it well that she's been raped. It doesn't do anything to the young man. It keeps him there in school. So it's basically favoring the person who's the perpetrator of this crime. Now, again, at this point, it's all alleged. I talked to the police in West Des Moines who handled this case, and I asked them if they believed the young woman, and they absolutely did. They believed that she was telling the truth. They said that her story, her version of events, adds up completely, and his does not. And yet the county attorney declined to press charges against him. He moved away eventually to a southern state, and I wrote a column at the time, the headline of which was, "Is Dowling," that was the name of the Catholic school, "Is Dowling punishing a victim?" And I talked about the injustice of expelling this young girl who said she was a rape victim from school while nothing was done to the young man who she said did it. And in fact, there were no charges filed against him. Some time passes, and then I spoke to the young woman. She allowed me to interview her, although we didn't use her name. Some time passed after I had written the piece, maybe it was 18 months later or so, and I was contacted by a girl at a school in the South where this boy had now relocated. And the girl said to me, I go to school with this boy and he raped me. And I looked up his name, I Googled him, and I found your column in which you were talking about his having allegedly raped another woman in Iowa, and I'd really like to compare notes with her. Can you put us in touch? So that spoke volumes to me. It told me that there was some basis for what she had been saying, that she couldn't be making it up. It just doesn't happen. It's too uncanny that the same kinds of circumstances, and the circumstances that she narrated were very similar to the ones that the original girl had told me about. Nothing came of it. He wasn't prosecuted in either case. But years went by, and it was 15 years since I wrote the original column. I had moved to Florida. I had moved back. I came in one morning, and there was a message left on my answering machine. And it was a young woman asking me to call her. And she just said her name, and the name didn't ring a bell. I didn't remember her name. I called her back, and she said, I'm the one who you wrote about 15 years ago after I was raped at school. And she said, I have carried that column around with me for 15 years. And she said, I've since moved to another city. I've gotten my life together. I got a lot of therapy. I've become a counselor of sexual assault victims myself, and I'm fine. My life is okay. But she said, so many times I have reread that column, as I did last night in the middle of the night, and I shed a few tears about it, and I thought I should tell you that often that has been the only thing that has kept me from killing myself, knowing that somebody believed me, because everybody else didn't, because the law enforcement system didn't, the school didn't, the community didn't, even my own mother didn't. She said, but you did, and that's what's kept me alive. And it just made me, and it chokes me up every time I think about that incident, because how close somebody came to ending her life because she was disbelieved, and how important it is to tell these stories and to advocate for people who can't advocate for themselves in the context of an institution, and how, pig-headed we can be as institutions for not getting it, for not fundamentally understanding what we do to young women when we disempower them that way. That's really why I wrote this book. That's why it's so important for people to understand these stories and the roots of rage that is sometimes, kept really in covers. because there are so many women who have good reason to feel enraged about how they've been treated. But fortunately, when they use their voices, when they speak up, when we can share their stories, things do change, even if it means just one person doesn't kill herself.